A piece of land smaller than New Jersey has caused 4 major wars, hundreds of United Nations resolutions, and the deaths of more than 145,000 people over 77 years. Israel and Palestine. 2 peoples, 1 land, no peace. From October 7, 2023 to January 14, 2026, more than 73,600 people have been killed in the deadliest war in the history of this conflict. Even with a ceasefire agreement in October 2025, more than 425 Palestinians have continued to be killed. Why, after 77 years, can these 2 sides not achieve peace? The answer lies in a map drawn in 1947 and the fateful decisions that created this unsolvable conflict. But the story begins even earlier, in the late 19th century, when 2 national movements collided. In this video, we will explore 1. The 1947 United Nations Partition Plan, why Israel accepted, why Arabs rejected, and the consequences that persist to 2026. 2. The 1948 Nakba and the 1967 Six-Day War, 2 events that created the geographic and psychological reality of the conflict. 3. The Israeli perspective on security and existence, the Palestinian perspective on occupation and human rights, and the international community's view on international law. 4. Why the 2-state solution, endorsed by the entire world, remains impossible after 30 years of the Oslo Accords. And 5. The war from October 2023 to January 2026. Why this is the most dangerous moment since 1948, and why even a ceasefire agreement cannot stop the violence. If you want to understand the Israel-Palestine conflict beyond the headlines, stay with me for the next 20 minutes.
To understand why peace remains impossible, we must first understand what is happening right now in January 2026. This is not ancient history. People are dying today. On October 7, 2023, Hamas and other militants launched a coordinated attack on southern Israel. 1,200 people were killed, including 815 civilians. 251 hostages were taken into Gaza. The United Nations documented systematic sexual violence during these attacks. Israel's response was immediate and overwhelming. From October 2023 to January 2026, the Israeli military launched a massive bombing campaign and ground invasion of the Gaza Strip. According to the Gaza Health Ministry and the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as of January 6, 2026, more than 73,600 people have been killed, 72,437 Palestinians, and 2,109 Israelis. More than 169,000 people have been injured. According to the United Nations satellite analysis from July 2025, 78% of all buildings across Gaza have been destroyed. The World Bank assessed the damage in February 2025 at $55 billion. That is 97% of the combined GDP of the West Bank, 1.9 million people. 90% of Gaza's population have been displaced. More than 50% of the population faces imminent risk of famine. 658,000 children have no access to education. 84% of health facilities have been damaged or destroyed. In October 2025, United States President Donald Trump announced a ceasefire deal. The agreement came into effect on October 10, 2025. Under Phase 1, Hamas released 20 living hostages on October 13. In exchange, Israel released 2,000 Palestinian prisoners, including 250 serving life sentences and 1,700 detained since October 7, 2023. But the ceasefire has been violated continuously. On March 18, 2025, Israel launched a surprise attack, breaking the ceasefire. A third ceasefire came into effect on October 10, 2025. But the violence never truly stopped. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, since the October 10 ceasefire, at least 425 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli attacks. Israel established what it calls the Yellow Line, a military boundary controlling 53% of Gaza. This line moves westward, expanding Israeli control despite the ceasefire. Israeli strikes occur near daily in areas close to the Yellow Line. On January 8, 2026, an Israeli airstrike hit a tent for displaced people in the Al-Mawasi area, killing a 5-year-old girl. On January 11, Israeli quadcopters killed a Palestinian man being transported to a hospital in Khan Yunis. In the West Bank, the situation is also dire. According to the United Nations, between October 7, 2023 and December 20, 2025, 1,043 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank, including at least 229 children. It is winter in Gaza. Temperatures have fallen to 9 degrees Celsius at night. People are living in torn tents and damaged buildings. According to Doctors Without Borders, Palestinians are suffering from respiratory infections, wound complications, and skin diseases due to harsh living conditions. Babies are suffering from severe cold. Israel continues to block or limit the entry of vital supplies into Gaza, including tents, building materials, and medical equipment. This violates the ceasefire agreement and Israel's obligations under international law as the occupying power. So why can Israel and Palestine not make peace? Why, after 77 years, do these two sides remain locked in conflict? Why does the world, including the United States, the United Nations, and the Arab nations, all support a two-state solution, yet it remains impossible to achieve? The answer is not simple. It is not about one side being right and the other being wrong. It is about two national movements with incompatible demands, competing historical narratives, and deep-seated existential fears. To understand this, we must go back to the beginning, to the map drawn in 1947. But even before that, to the rise of two nationalisms in the late 19th century.
But this is not a conflict that began yesterday, or even in 2023. To understand why Israel and Palestine cannot make peace, we must go back to the moment when two national movements collided over the same piece of land. This story begins in the late 19th century, when nationalism was sweeping across Europe and the Middle East. In the late 1800s, Jewish people across Europe faced rising anti-Semitism. Pogroms in Russia killed thousands. In France, the Dreyfus Affair exposed deep hatred toward Jews, even in supposedly enlightened societies. In 1896, an Austrian Jewish journalist named Theodor Herzl witnessed the Dreyfus trial and concluded that Jews would never be safe in Europe. He wrote a book called Der Judenstaat, which means the Jewish state. His argument was simple. Jews needed their own country, a place where they could defend themselves. In 1897, the First Zionist Congress met in Basel, Switzerland. Delegates from around the world gathered to formalize a goal: to establish a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, secured by public law. This was the birth of political Zionism, a national liberation movement for the Jewish people. Waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine began. These immigrants, known as the Aliyah, purchased land from Ottoman landlords and established agricultural settlements. They were building the foundations of a future state. But Palestine was not empty. It was a province of the Ottoman Empire, inhabited overwhelmingly by Arab Muslims and Christians, with a small, long-standing Jewish minority. The Arab population watched as Jewish immigration increased year after year. Land purchases displaced Arab tenant farmers. New settlements appeared on the landscape. The local Arab population began to develop their own distinct national consciousness, separate from the broader Ottoman identity. Two national movements, Jewish and Arab Palestinian, were forming over the same territory. Then came World War I. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the region fell under British control. In 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a letter that would shape the next century. The Balfour Declaration stated that Britain viewed with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, provided that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. This was a promise to support Jewish state building while protecting Arab rights. It was a chemically unstable diplomatic formula. You cannot build a Jewish state without affecting the Arab majority population. In 1920, the League of Nations granted Britain a mandate to govern Palestine. The text of the mandate incorporated the Balfour Declaration. This created what historians call the dual obligation. Britain was supposed to facilitate Jewish immigration and state building, while simultaneously protecting the rights of the Arab population. It was an impossible task.
The 1920s and 1930s were marked by escalating violence. In 1929, Arab rioters killed 67 Jews in Hebron, effectively destroying the ancient Jewish community there. From 1936 to 1939, Arabs launched a massive revolt against British rule and Jewish immigration. The British suppressed the revolt brutally, but they also recognized that the status quo was unsustainable. The Peel Commission in 1936 proposed partitioning Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. Arab leaders rejected this proposal. They viewed it as a violation of the rights of the indigenous majority. In 1939, on the eve of World War II, Britain issued the White Paper, severely restricting Jewish immigration to Palestine. This alienated the Zionist leadership, who viewed it as a betrayal during the darkest hour of Jewish history in Europe. The Holocaust was beginning. After World War II, with 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, Britain could no longer manage the competing insurgencies in Palestine. Britain handed the problem to the newly formed United Nations. The UN Special Committee on Palestine recommended partition. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 181. This is the map that explains everything. The Partition Plan proposed dividing mandatory Palestine into two independent states. The Jewish state would receive 56.47% of the land, despite Jews constituting only 1/3 of the population and owning only about 7% of the land. The Arab state would receive 42.88%. Jerusalem would remain an international zone controlled by neither side. Let us examine the details. The proposed Jewish state included the fertile coastal plain and the Negev desert. Its population would be 498,000 Jews and 407,000 Arabs. Nearly half the population of the Jewish state would be Arab. The proposed Arab state included the hilly interior, the West Bank, and the Gaza coast. Its population would be 725,000 Arabs and 10,000 Jews. The Jewish Agency accepted the partition plan. Despite owning only 7% of the land, they were being offered 56% and international recognition for a Jewish state. After the Holocaust, this was a historic opportunity. But the Arab Higher Committee rejected the plan. From their perspective, the allocation was profoundly unjust. Arabs were 2/3 of the population, yet they were being offered only 42% of the land. The plan ignored the will of the indigenous majority. Why should Palestinian Arabs give up more than half their homeland to accommodate European Jewish refugees? They viewed partition as European colonialism. This rejection set the stage for war. Following the adoption of Resolution 181, civil war erupted between Jewish and Arab militias. On May 14, 1948, the British mandate expired. David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel. The following day, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded.
The narrative often portrays this as David versus Goliath, a tiny Jewish state facing overwhelming Arab armies. But the reality was more complex. The Israeli Defense Forces were better organized, better armed, and eventually outnumbered the uncoordinated Arab expeditionary forces. By the end of the war, Israel had expanded its territory from the 56% allocated by the UN to approximately 78% of mandatory Palestine. Jordan occupied and later annexed the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip. The Green Line, established by the 1949 armistice agreements, became the de facto border. For Israelis, 1948 is remembered as the War of Independence, the miraculous survival and birth of the Jewish state after 2,000 years of exile and persecution. For Palestinians, 1948 is remembered as the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. According to United Nations data, approximately 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from or fled their homes in what became Israel. More than 500 Palestinian villages were depopulated and destroyed to prevent the return of refugees. The mechanisms of flight varied. In some cases, such as in the towns of Lydda and Ramel, Jewish militias directly expelled the Palestinian population at gunpoint. In other cases, fear of massacres, such as the one at Deir Yassin, where 108 Palestinians were killed, caused panic and mass flight. In still other cases, the collapse of Palestinian society during the fighting led people to flee. Israel prevented the return of these refugees. The argument was that allowing 750,000 Arabs to return would fundamentally alter the Jewish character of the state and threaten its survival. This created the Palestinian refugee population, which now numbers over 5 million people registered with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA. These refugees are scattered across Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank, and Gaza. Many still live in refugee camps established in 1948, 77 years ago. In December 1948, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 194, which resolved that refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. Israel rejected this resolution. The Palestinians insist on it. This is the origin of the right of return dispute, one of the 4 core issues that makes peace impossible. But the conflict did not end in 1948. 19 years later, another war would fundamentally reshape the geography of the conflict. In June 1967, amidst escalating tensions, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. In just 6 days, the Israeli military achieved a stunning victory. Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt. Israel captured the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan. Israel captured the Golan Heights from Syria. For the first time since 1948, the entirety of mandatory Palestine was under Israeli control. Israel reunified Jerusalem, annexing the eastern sector and declaring the complete and united city its capital. This move was condemned by the international community and declared null and void by United Nations resolutions. In November 1967, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 242, which became the cornerstone of all subsequent diplomatic efforts. The resolution emphasized the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. It called for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict and the termination of all claims or states of belligerency with respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area.
Notice the wording carefully. The English version says, "From territories occupied, not from the territories occupied." The absence of the definite article, they allowed Israel to argue that it was not required to withdraw from all territories, but only to secure and recognized boundaries. The French version, however, uses the definite article, implying withdrawal from all occupied territories. This semantic ambiguity has allowed decades of debate. The territories Israel occupied in 1967, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, are home to more than 5 million Palestinians today. This is the heart of the conflict. Israel calls these disputed territories. The Palestinians and the international community call them occupied territories. This difference in terminology determines who is right and who is wrong under international law. After the 1973 Yom Kippur War and the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty, which saw Israel return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, the focus shifted to the Palestinian question. The First Intifada, a grassroots Palestinian uprising from 1987 to 1993, convinced Israeli leaders that the status quo was unsustainable. This led to the Oslo peace process. In 1993, the world watched as Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestine Liberation Organization Chairman Yasser Arafat shook hands at the White House. For the first time, Israel and the PLO recognized each other. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority as an interim self-governing body. Oslo II, signed in 1995, divided the West Bank into 3 zones. Area A comprises 18% of the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority has full control over security and civil affairs. This includes major Palestinian cities like Ramallah, Nablus, and Jenin. Area B comprises 22%. The Palestinian Authority has civil control, but Israel maintains security control. This includes Palestinian villages and rural areas. Area C comprises 60% of the West Bank. Israel has full control over both security and civil affairs. This includes all Israeli settlements, the Jordan Valley, military zones, and bypass roads connecting settlements. Look at a map of the West Bank today. It resembles Swiss cheese. Areas A and B are non-contiguous enclaves surrounded by Israeli-controlled Area C. The logic of Oslo was incrementalism. Build trust through interim arrangements, then tackle the final status issues: Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, and borders. But the process derailed. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated in 1995 by a Jewish extremist opposed to the peace process. Hamas launched a wave of suicide bombings, targeting Israeli civilians. And critically, Israeli settlements in Area C continued to expand throughout the Oslo period. In July 2000, President Bill Clinton convened Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Palestinian Authority Chairman Yasser Arafat at Camp David to negotiate a final peace deal. The summit ended in failure. This failure defines the current narrative war over who is to blame for the absence of peace.
The Israeli and American narrative claims that Barak offered the most generous proposal in history. Arafat rejected it without making a counteroffer. This allegedly proved that the Palestinian leadership was unwilling to make the compromises necessary for peace. But the Palestinian narrative tells a different story. Palestinians argue that the generous offer was a myth. The actual proposal offered 91 to 92% of the West Bank, not 97% as sometimes claimed. More importantly, the proposed Palestinian state would have been divided into non-contiguous cantons, separated by Israeli settlement blocks and bypass roads under Israeli control. On Jerusalem, the offer granted only functional autonomy over Arab neighborhoods, not full sovereignty over the Holy Basin, including the Temple Mount, known to Muslims as Haram al-Sharif. The land swap ratio was 9-1, meaning Israel would annex 9% of the best West Bank land and offer 1% of poor quality Israeli land in return. On refugees, there was no recognition of the right of return. In December 2000, Clinton proposed more specific parameters: 94 to 96% of the West Bank to Palestine, Israeli sovereignty over the Jewish quarter of the Old City and the Western Wall, Palestinian sovereignty over the Muslim and Christian quarters, and the Haram al-Sharif. The right of return would be limited to the new Palestinian state, not to Israel. Both sides accepted these parameters with reservations, but time ran out as the second intifada erupted. The truth is that Camp David was not a case of a generous Israeli offer versus Palestinian rejection. It was a case of two sides with demands that could not coexist. Let me explain the four core issues that make peace structurally impossible. The first issue is settlements. Since 1967, Israel has established a vast network of settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Today, more than 500,000 Israelis live in West Bank settlements in Area C, and more than 220,000 live in East Jerusalem. According to international consensus, backed by the United Nations Security Council and the International Court of Justice, settlements violate Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which states that the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. But Israel disputes this interpretation. The Israeli legal argument is that the Fourth Geneva Convention does not apply de jure because the West Bank is disputed territory, not occupied territory. Jordan's annexation of the West Bank from 1948 to 1967 was never internationally recognized. Therefore, there was no legitimate sovereign to whom the land belonged. A report commissioned by the Netanyahu government in 2012, known as the Levy Report, concluded that settlements are legal under Israeli domestic law and that Israelis have a right to settle in their historic homeland.
Regardless of the legal debate, the practical problem is clear. A two-state solution requires a contiguous Palestinian state. Settlements create a Swiss cheese geography that makes this impossible. Look at the map. Major settlement blocks, like Ma'ale Adumim east of Jerusalem, Ariel deep in the northern West Bank, and Gush Etzion south of Bethlehem, cut the West Bank into fragmented zones. Bypass roads connecting settlements to Israel proper further divide Palestinian areas. Even if Israel withdrew from most of Area C, the remaining settlement blocks would make a viable, contiguous Palestinian state impossible. The second issue is the right of return. For Palestinians, this is a sacred principle. Based on United Nations Resolution 194, Palestinians argue that the 5 million refugees and their descendants have an individual human right to return to their original homes in what is now Israel. They view this as a fundamental human right that cannot be negotiated away by political leaders. For Israel, the right of return is existential suicide. If even a fraction of 5 million Palestinian refugees returned to Israel, the Jewish majority would disappear. Israel would cease to be a Jewish state, and become a binational state with an Arab majority. Israel argues that refugees should be resettled in the future Palestinian state, or absorbed by host countries, similar to how Israel absorbed Jewish refugees from Arab lands after 1948. Israel is willing to discuss compensation, but not return. The third issue is Jerusalem. Israel claims united Jerusalem as its eternal, undivided capital. This was codified in the Basic Law of 1980. Palestinians claim East Jerusalem, known in Arabic as Al-Quds, as the capital of their future state. The dispute centers on the Old City, particularly the 35-acre plateau, known to Jews as the Temple Mount and to Muslims as Haram al-Sharif. This is the holiest site in Judaism, the location of the first and second temples. The Western Wall, the last remaining wall of the Second Temple, is the most sacred site where Jews can pray. But the same plateau is also the third holiest site in Islam. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque stand there. According to Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven from this location. For Christians, the Old City contains the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus was crucified and resurrected. At Camp David in 2000, the failure to agree on sovereignty over this 35-acre site was the primary deal breaker. Ehud Barak proposed that Israel maintain sovereignty over the Temple Mount, with Palestinians having administrative control over the surface mosques. Arafat rejected this, insisting on full Palestinian sovereignty. Neither side could compromise, because this is not just politics, it is theology. The fourth issue is security versus freedom. Israel argues that it needs security control over the West Bank to prevent terrorism. The Second Intifada from 2000 to 2005 killed over 1,000 Israelis, many in suicide bombings targeting buses, cafes, and markets. Israel built the separation barrier, imposed checkpoints, and maintained military control over Area C. The Israeli argument is that the moment security control is lifted, terrorist groups will use the West Bank to launch attacks, just as Hamas used Gaza after the 2005 disengagement.
Palestinians argue that the occupation itself is the root cause of violence. Living under military rule without freedom of movement, economic opportunity, or dignity breeds desperation and resistance. Checkpoints humiliate Palestinians daily. Home demolitions punish entire families. Administrative detention allows Israel to imprison Palestinians without charge or trial. From the Palestinian perspective, ending the occupation is the prerequisite for ending violence, not the other way around. This is a vicious cycle. Israeli security measures create Palestinian anger. Palestinian violence justifies more Israeli restrictions. Neither side trusts the other enough to take the first step. Now, let me show you why the map makes peace impossible. Look at the West Bank today. It is cut by settlements, bypass roads, checkpoints, and the separation wall. A contiguous Palestinian state is geographically impossible. But Israel cannot annex the West Bank either, because that would add 2.6 million Palestinians to Israel's population. This would eliminate the Jewish majority. Israel would face a choice: grant full citizenship to Palestinians and become a binational state, or deny citizenship and create a formal apartheid system. This brings us to the apartheid debate, one of the most controversial questions in international discourse today. In 2021 and 2022, Major human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, released comprehensive reports concluding that Israel commits the crime of apartheid against Palestinians. Their evidence includes the following. First, Palestinians in the West Bank live under Israeli military law, while Israeli settlers in the same territory live under Israeli civil law, two separate legal systems based on ethnicity. Second, Israel controls Palestinian movement through a permit system. Palestinians need permits to travel between West Bank cities, to work in Israel, to visit Jerusalem. Israelis move freely. Third, land policies systematically favor Jewish settlement and discriminate against Palestinian construction. In Area C, which covers 60% of the West Bank, Israel approves building permits for Jewish settlements, but rejects nearly all Palestinian applications, then demolishes Palestinian homes built without permits. Fourth, the Jewish nation-state law of 2018 defines Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people exclusively, relegating non-Jews to second-class status.
The counter-argument from Israel and its supporters is that the apartheid comparison is false and defamatory. They point out that Arab citizens of Israel, who comprise 20% of Israel's population, have full voting rights. Arabs serve in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and on the Supreme Court. This is fundamentally different from South Africa, where black citizens had no political rights. Regarding the West Bank, Israel argues that restrictions are security measures driven by terrorism, not racial policy. When suicide bombings stopped after the Second Intifada, some checkpoints were removed and restrictions eased. The situation is not comparable to South Africa's legally enshrined racial hierarchy. Israel also argues that the apartheid label is part of a broader campaign to delegitimize the Jewish state's right to exist. Neutral observers note that the debate often conflates two separate realities. Within Israel proper, Arab citizens have legal rights, though discrimination exists in practice. In the West Bank, there is indeed a two-tier system based on ethnicity. Whether this meets the technical, legal definition of apartheid under international law is debated, but the reality on the ground involves systematic inequality. So, we have four unsolvable issues. Settlements make a contiguous Palestinian state impossible. The right of return threatens Israel's Jewish majority. Jerusalem is a theological dispute with no compromise. And security versus freedom is a vicious cycle of mistrust. This is why the two-state solution, endorsed by the United Nations, the United States, the European Union, and the Arab League, remains a fantasy.
This brings us to October 7, 2023, and the catastrophic war that followed. To understand why this attack happened, we need to understand the strategic context. For more than a decade, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pursued a policy of managing the conflict rather than resolving it. The strategy was to maintain the blockade on Gaza while keeping Hamas in power. Why keep Hamas in power? Because as long as Gaza was controlled by Hamas and the West Bank by the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian territories remained divided. A divided Palestinian leadership cannot negotiate. No negotiations meant no pressure on Israel to make concessions toward a two-state solution. Netanyahu himself stated that anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state must support strengthening Hamas. To implement this strategy, Israel allowed Qatari cash to flow into Gaza through Israeli checkpoints. Hundreds of millions of dollars went to Hamas. Israel also issued work permits allowing Gazans to work in Israel. The assumption was that Hamas could be bought off, that providing limited economic relief would prevent a major escalation. October 7 proved this assumption catastrophically wrong. Hamas was not deterred. It was planning the largest and deadliest attack in Israeli history. On the morning of October 7, Hamas breached the border fence using explosives and bulldozers. Thousands of militants poured into southern Israel. They attacked kibbutzim, towns, and a music festival. 1,200 people were killed, 75% of them civilians. At the Nova Music Festival, 364 people were massacred. In kibbutzim, like Be'eri and Kfar Aza, entire families were murdered in their homes. 251 hostages, including babies and elderly people, were dragged into Gaza. United Nations investigators documented systematic sexual violence during the attacks, including rape and mutilation. Israel declared war with the stated objectives of dismantling Hamas's military and governing capabilities and securing the release of all hostages. The Israeli Defense Forces launched a massive aerial bombardment, followed by a ground invasion. By January 2026, the scale of destruction in Gaza was unprecedented. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, over 72,000 Palestinians have been killed. The United Nations and independent researchers estimate that the true death toll, including those buried under rubble and indirect deaths from starvation and disease, may exceed 93,000. The number of injured is over 169,000. According to a study published in the Lancet Medical Journal, Gaza now has the most amputated children per capita in the world. A joint assessment by the World Bank and the United Nations in February 2025 calculated that $55 billion in physical infrastructure has been destroyed. This is 97% of the combined GDP of the West Bank and Gaza. United Nations satellite analysis from July 2025 showed that 78% of all structures across the Gaza Strip have been damaged or destroyed. Entire neighborhoods have been leveled. Cities like Rafah, Khan Yunis, and Gaza City are unrecognizable. The water and sanitation system operates at less than 5% capacity, creating imminent risks of cholera and other waterborne diseases. 70% of agricultural land has been destroyed. According to the United Nations, more than 50% of Gaza's population is experiencing catastrophic levels of hunger. Healthcare workers who served in Gaza reported in October 2024 that at least 62,000 people, most of them young children, have likely died from starvation. In January 2024, South Africa filed a case at the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of violating the Genocide Convention. The court found it plausible that Israel's actions could amount to genocide and ordered provisional measures to prevent genocidal acts and ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid. The court did not order a ceasefire, but it emphasized the catastrophic humanitarian situation. In September 2025, the United Nations Human Rights Council concluded that Israel bears responsibility for the failure to prevent genocide against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Israel vehemently rejects the genocide accusation. The Israeli government argues that it is fighting a war of self-defense against a genocidal terrorist group that embeds itself in civilian infrastructure. Israel points to its efforts to evacuate civilians from combat zones and argues that civilian casualties are the tragic but unavoidable result of Hamas using human shields. In October 2025, President Trump announced a ceasefire deal. The agreement called for a phased approach. Phase 1 involved the release of all remaining Israeli hostages in exchange for 2,000 Palestinian prisoners, withdrawal of Israeli forces to designated lines within Gaza, and a surge in humanitarian aid. On October 13, Hamas released the 20 living hostages, but only 4 of the 28 deceased hostages were handed over. The ceasefire has failed to stop the violence. Since October 10, 2025, at least 425 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli attacks, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. Israel maintains control over 53% of Gaza through what it calls the Yellow Line, a military boundary that moves westward, expanding Israeli control. Israeli strikes occur near daily. Humanitarian aid remains blocked or severely restricted. Israel has refused to allow a free flow of tents, building materials, and medical supplies into Gaza.
In the middle of winter, with temperatures falling to 9 degrees Celsius, Palestinians are living in torn tents and makeshift shelters. Babies are suffering from severe cold. The Gaza Civil Defense warns of a catastrophe as tents collapse in storms. Nearly 80% of buildings are destroyed or damaged, yet Israel prevents the entry of reconstruction materials. This is not a weather crisis, it is a policy crisis. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, violence has surged. Over 1,000 Palestinians have been killed since October 7, 2023, including more than 200 children. Israeli forces have launched large-scale military operations in refugee camps, demolishing buildings and infrastructure. In January 2025, Israel launched Operation Iron Wall in the northern West Bank, causing widespread destruction. There is no viable political endgame. Israel rejects any role for Hamas, but also opposes the return of the Palestinian Authority, viewing it as supportive of terrorism. Israel has suggested indefinite security control over Gaza. The United States advocates for a revitalized Palestinian Authority to govern Gaza, linking reconstruction to a renewed pathway toward a two-state solution. But Arab states, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, have refused to fund reconstruction without an irreversible path to Palestinian statehood. And there is no consensus on that path.
As we have seen, the Israel-Palestine conflict is rooted in a map drawn in 1947, when the United Nations partitioned Palestine into two states. Israel accepted, Arabs rejected, believing the allocation was unjust. The 1948 war created the Nakba, displacing 750,000 Palestinian refugees. The 1967 war created the occupation, placing the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem under Israeli control. The Oslo Accords in 1993 promised peace, but failed. Camp David in 2000 failed because the demands of both sides could not coexist. Today, Israeli settlements make the two-state solution geographically impossible. The Palestinian right of return makes it demographically unacceptable to Israel. And violence continues. 73,000 people have been killed since October 2023. 425 Palestinians have been killed since the October 2025 ceasefire, proving that even ceasefire agreements cannot stop the violence. The situation remains extraordinarily complex, with legitimate concerns on multiple sides. From the Israeli perspective, October 7 was a national trauma. 1,200 people killed, hostages still held in Gaza. Hamas's charter calls for the destruction of Israel. Israel has the right to self-defense and to protect its citizens from terrorism. From the Palestinian perspective, they have endured 57 years of occupation and 77 years since the Nakba. 5 million refugees have been denied the right of return. 72,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. They live without freedom, dignity, or a political horizon. Their right to self-determination has been denied. From the international perspective, both sides have violated international law. Both have historical claims and grievances. But the current status quo, occupation, blockade, and ongoing violence is unsustainable and violates human rights on a massive scale. Moving forward, several scenarios are possible. Continued violence and periodic escalations. International intervention with a stabilization force. Expansion of the regional war involving Iran and Hezbollah. Or perhaps a new generation of leaders with the political will to make historic compromises. Only time will tell. What is certain is this. The map drawn in 1947 continues to shape the fate of millions of people today. And history rarely offers simple answers. The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is not about one side being right and the other being wrong. It is about two peoples with incompatible nationalisms, competing claims, and deep existential fears, struggling over a small piece of land that both call home. If you found this analysis valuable, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more balanced perspectives on global affairs